In Things That Matter, Charles Krauthammer presents his writings on various social and political issues, including limited government, feminism, and the death penalty. He spoke about his book at the George W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum in Dallas, Texas. This is just under an hour.
Good evening, everyone, and happy birthday, Mrs. Bush. Well, this is a great personal pleasure for me because, as Charles reminded me in the green room, we've known each other now for 32 years. I was briefly Charles's employer. Charles Krauthammer has written a fantastic book, a compilation of his columns, plus just a marvelous introduction. And as somebody who used to be in the publishing business, I know one thing, which is that compilations never sell. Charles's book is #1 on Amazon and will debut as #2 in nonfiction on the New York Times bestseller list this Sunday. He's ahead of John Grisham and Bill O'Reilly and Rush, and you name it, Charles. Charles Krauthammer was born in New York City. He was raised in Montreal. He went to McGill, and after that was a Commonwealth scholar at Oxford, then went to the Harvard Medical School and was a psychiatrist, practiced for 3 years, was the chief resident at Massachusetts General Hospital. Then briefly went to work for President Carter, was a speechwriter for Vice President Mondale during his presidential campaign, and then where I got to meet him was when he came to the New Republic in early 1981. And at the time, the New Republic, if I may say so, was it was the golden age. Charles was there, and Mike Kinsley and Rick Hertzberg, and what was interesting about it, at least to me, was that you had a group of people who had different ideas and frequently fought over them, but it wasn't a monolith. At any rate, Charles won the National Magazine Award for commentary in 1984, a very coveted prize for anybody who's a magazine writer. And then in 1985, he went to work for the Washington Post as a columnist. And within 2 years, he had won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary. Since then, he has continued to write for the Washington Post. One of the things that Charles taught me when I was an aspiring columnist was that you write one column a week. It's hard to do more than that, and even one is not so easy. Joe Scarborough called him the most powerful force in American conservatism, and I think that's an accurate description. David Brooks has called him the most important conservative columnist. You're going to hear from him tonight, and we will have, Charles will speak, we'll hear questions from the floor, so save up your questions, you're in for a real treat. Charles Krauthammer.
Thank you. Thank you, James. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you for being here, Mr. President, Mr. Bush. There are nice introductions and there are kind introductions. A nice introduction is where they say all the nice stuff about you. They list your achievements. They have it transcribed and notarized, and they send your mother a copy. A kind introduction is where they leave stuff out. Now, despite your intentions, that was a distinctly unkind introduction because you included two things which I now have to explain. First, there's the Mondale bit. Yes, it's true. I was speechwriter for Walter Mondale, and people ask me, as you can imagine, how do you go from Walter Mondale to Fox News? The answer is simple. I was young once. And then there's a psychiatry part. Got to explain that, too. Yes, it is true that I once was a psychiatrist. Actually, technically speaking, I still am. But in reality, I'm a psychiatrist in remission. Doing very well, thank you. Haven't had a relapse in 25 years. And of course, I'm asked to compare what I do today as a political analyst in Washington with what I used to do as a psychiatrist in Boston. And I tell people it really isn't that different. In both lines of work, I deal every day with people who suffer from paranoia and delusions of grandeur. The only difference is that the paranoids in Washington have access to nuclear weapons. Present company excluded. Which makes the stakes a little higher and the work a little more interesting. I am really honored and delighted to be here at the Bush Library, to have seen the Bushes. I'm happy to be among you, but truth be told, I'm happy to be anywhere where Juan Williams can't interrupt me. I'll be sure to tell him how you feel. I want to begin by saying how much I appreciate, Mr. President, what you did for the nation at the moment of maximal danger. How you were clear-eyed, straightforward, and courageous in rallying the nation against a new barbarism, and you were never afraid to use that word and that idea, managing to recognize Islam as a great religion while at the same time seeing no contradiction in denouncing, opposing, and rallying the nation to fight the perverted branch of Islam which attacked us so wantonly on 9/11. I wrote at the time, and I believe to this day, that history will treat you like Harry Truman, recognizing the depths of your achievement in creating the very infrastructure that will carry us through this war on barbarism. We're already seeing this today in a kind of backhanded tribute to you, as those who so criticized you during those 8 years, the very people who did criticize you in those 8 years, when they came to power, they adopted the very same tools that you bequeathed to them, and that you and that your administration had created ex nihilo in a moment of national confusion and danger, just as Truman did in his day, providing the infrastructure, the tools, and the institutions that carried us through the Cold War in those days and will carry us through this war in this generation. And if I can just repeat what I said to you in private, but I'd like to say it in public, that I spoke to my wife earlier today. She asked me to convey to you her admiration and respect for what you did for our country, the steadiness of your voice, the depth of your devotion to the country, and your determination to see things through, even when you were nearly alone. Now, I know I'm supposed to be selling books, but I just had to say that first, especially the wife part. Otherwise, when I get home tomorrow night, I'll be sleeping on the couch. So, now about the book. It's called Things That Matter, 30 Years of Passions, Pastimes and Politics, and it's very good. You should buy it. You should buy lots of copies, especially for your liberal friends, if you have any left. I don't. So in conclusion, no, that was just a test. I wanted to see whether I'd get the kind of applause that Clinton got at the '88 convention, when after 50 minutes he used those words and the place erupted not just in applause but in celebration. But I digress. About the book. The book is several things. The first thing, because it does span my career as a journalist, going all the way back to, as Jim said, 1981. In fact, I started on the day that Ronald Reagan was sworn into the presidency. It's a chronicle of the last 3 decades. And those 3 decades are historically a time of enormous fascination, which it was my privilege to witness and to comment on. The 80s, the Reagan Revolution and the last days of the Cold War. The 90s, our holiday from history. The 2000s, the beginning of the age of holy terror. And for the last half decade, this week is the 5th anniversary of the winning of the presidency by Barack Obama and the rise of a new kind, a new, more ambitious, and I might even say radical kind of American liberalism. Regarding the 80s, I think the one column that sort of captures it the best is the one in which Bill Clinton says during his presidency, we look back on that era, he meant the Cold War era, and we long for, I made a crack the other day, I said, gosh, I miss the Cold War. It was a joke, I mean, I didn't really miss it, but you get the joke. And the point was that we had this myth created after conservatism in the decade of the 80s utterly destroyed and undid what was left of the Soviet Empire and of communism. This myth that there was a great national consensus on how to confront the Soviets. Now, there was in the 50s and the 60s, but it dissolved after the Vietnam era, and there was a great division in the country. And the 80s were distinguished by the fact that there was a total breakdown of that consensus. And I write about that in the column because, as Jim mentioned in the introduction, at the New Republic, this was a liberal magazine. It was the bone of contention between me and, well, essentially everybody else on the magazine, because I began to support publicly and in writing many of the things that Reagan did, essentially the things that he did that won the Cold War. And we had these huge arguments internally, but I ended up writing a lot of the unsigned editorials. It began with the Democrats falling and swooning for this hysteria for the nuclear freeze. And I wrote the unsigned editorial attacking the freeze rather mercilessly. And what I like the best about it is that I found out at the next editorial meeting that it caused the largest number of cancellations in the history of the magazine. Jim will remember that, for which I was rather proud. You may also remember, Jim, that at that very same session, given the bitterness and the anger and the volume of the letters that came in attacking us, and me in particular, that we should choose someone to read all the letters every week, to choose the worst, the most vitriolic one, and to cancel that person's subscription. I wanted to do it without a refund, but the business side was not very happy about that either. But the point was, and this helped to move me from left to right, was the fact that the Democrats vociferously opposed every step in the Reagan foreign policy agenda that we now know empirically helped to bring down the Soviet Union. And that was both the issue of the nuclear, resisting the freeze, the demonstrations in the street, the deployment of Euro missiles to counter the Soviet missiles that they had imposed in Eastern Europe, the Reagan Doctrine, which helped reverse the terms of the Cold War, and finally, the idea of the missile defense, which has the one great advantage to us today, and at the time so scared the Soviets that it really led to their giving up on the race with us in the Cold War and realizing they had no chance of winning, which led to the most remarkable event of our lifetime, an event of biblical proportions, which was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the conquest of communism without a shot fired. And that was sort of the core of the 1980s. That is what history will remember the 80s for. And again, as I say, I write in the introduction of the book in trying to trace my evolution from left to right. That was the essence of my leaving the Democratic Party, because you remember, a lot of young people today do not. But in the 1970s, there was a very strong conservative element in the Democratic Party. They were known as National Security Democrats or Cold War liberals in the tradition of Truman, Kennedy, Humphrey, and Scoop Jackson, who happened to have been my great political hero in my 20s, in my youth. In fact, when Scoop ran for the nomination in 1976, he ran in the Massachusetts Democratic primary. I was a doctor at the time at the Mass General, and I handed out leaflets. Now, Jackson won the Massachusetts primary. I handed out a lot of leaflets. But as you know, of course, he didn't win the nomination. And that was because, despite the fact that he was a wonderful human being, very smart, and had the right policies, I hate to say this, but he was exceedingly dull. And it was said of Scoop Jackson that if he ever gave a fireside chat, the fire would go out. I sure knew how to pick winners back then. I go on in the book to talk about the 90s, of course, to write about the 90s. And here's what was the most remarkable thing about the 90s. Nothing happened. Nothing world historical happened. I was aware of the absence of things happening in a way that almost scared me. What I mean to say is the great ideological struggles, existential struggles of the century stopped overnight. Christmas 1991, there is no Soviet Union. I never imagined that I would live to see the end of the Soviet Union. And here it happens overnight, quietly in the night. And we have a decade of unrivaled prosperity and peace. And I was acutely aware that this is not normal in history. I wrote about it. There's a column in the book called The Golden Age. I gave a speech to my son's high school in 1997. And I tried to explain to them that we were living in an incredibly anomalous and magnificent time of a profound peace and prosperity, of no existential threats at all around the world. And I tried to impress upon them how unusual this was. Of course, I failed utterly. They had never experienced anything other than that, and they thought this is as natural as the air you breathe. But I had this terrible sense, it's a wonderful sense, but a terrible sense at the same time, that this golden age couldn't last. They never do. You go back to all the golden ages, back to the Greeks. They're always short. And I was seized with this intense feeling that it had to end, that we should enjoy it, but that we should not expect it, because this is not what history normally is. So even though I didn't tell the class that it was going to end, after all, that would have been child abuse, you know. You guys are having a good time, I'm not going to tell you. But I wrote, because I write for adults, that this had to end. And I wrote in the column called The Golden Age. And the only question was, how soon would it come, the end? And would it end by fire or by ice? And we know how it ended. It ended in fire on 9/11. And that signaled to us that something had happened, something new, something terrible. Another column that's in the book is the column I wrote that afternoon. It was in the Post the next morning. And the problem I had writing it was not the pressure of time, but the pressure of rage. I was trying to write in a way where I would be able to contain it, to actually write coherent sentences one after the other. And the point I tried to make in that column, and I put it in the book for that reason, is that I could feel the historic paradigm changing. This was history returning with a vengeance. And what I mean by history is the kind of existential struggle that is the norm in history, not the 1990s, which were the exception. That we had now returned overnight in a flash, without asking for it, without inviting it, simply because we were the great power that we were. We had returned to the time of the great existential struggles. This was the new face of what was once fascism, Nazism, and communism. And that because of that, everything had to change. And that sort of was the essence of the decade. And as I said earlier in my talk, I think that we were lucky to have a president who understood that and courageously explained that to us and took us into that fight. Finally, there's the last half decade, which is of equal historic fascination. And that is the age of Barack Obama. Obama is interesting because he's not just a liberal. Well, you know what a liberal is. A liberal is somebody who doesn't care what you do as long as it's mandatory. Which until Thursday was a joke, when Jay Carney tried to explain why when your health insurance is taken away from you, this is actually a good thing. And he actually said that you can choose any health plan you want so long as it's the health plan that the government has mandated, which is the joke in real life. There is no way to make this stuff up. Sort of it exceeds irony. But Obama isn't even a liberal. He's a social democrat. And this I argued from, and it's in the column, he gave a speech to a joint session of Congress a month after his inauguration, in which he explained who he was. He dropped the mask. He'd been in the '08 election. He was a Rorschach test. But now he explained exactly who he was. He'd been in office for a month. There was no need for the veil. And he basically said, I'm not a Clinton, I'm not a tinkerer, I'm here to change America. And he went ahead and explained exactly how he's going to do it. Healthcare, education, and energy, and we saw what he did. $1 trillion stimulus, the largest spending bill in galactic history. And then he followed it with Obamacare, which is a revolution in 1/6, a takeover of 1/6 of the American economy, which to me, and I wrote at the time, before he enacted all this, made him a social democrat on the European model. Very unusual for the United States. People ask me, well, what's a social democrat? So the only way to explain it, I think, is with a famous anecdote about Winston Churchill. This is after he loses the election at the end of the Second World War. Clement Attlee, the Labour Party leader, the socialist, becomes prime minister. Churchill's leader of the opposition. One day he goes down to the men's room in the House of Commons, and there standing alone at one of the urinals is Clement Attlee. Don't worry, that's as weird as it gets. Churchill goes all the way to the other end of the men's room to a urinal 15 stalls over, and Attlee is puzzled. He looks over and says, feeling a bit standoffish, are we, Winston? Churchill says, not at all, my dear Clement. It's just that every time you see something large, you want to nationalize it. I kind of like that one too, and I'm not even sure it's true. It could be apocryphal, but I don't care. As we say in the column writing business, that story is too good to check. It remains unchecked, but it's in the book. Probably the only item that's unchecked. Now, so I try to write about Obama in that vein, trying to understand him as a social democrat. And the essence of the political half of the book is that Obama represents this kind of, I would say, aggressive American liberalism, and that in some way, the debate that we've had over the last 5 years between left and right since Obama came into office is essentially a debate over the classic, the fundamental issue of our democracy. And all the debates, Obamacare, cap and trade, the stimulus, energy break, all of these things are subsidiary to the central question that has been at the heart of our politics ever since he was sworn in. And that is, what is the proper size and scope and reach and province of government? Or to put it slightly more grandly, what's the nature of the American experiment? And to put it in its grandest terms, we've been arguing about the relationship between citizen and state. And the one column that sort of addresses that the most directly is a column called "Did the State Make You Great?" And remember, that came right after Obama made the famous statement, if you have a business and you've had success, you didn't build that, somebody else made it happen. I mean, that's a crystallization of the great argument between left and right. And I try to point out in the column, Obama said what was almost a platitude. You don't operate alone. There are other people around. There's roads and bridges. The mistake that liberalism makes, and here's the core, and it came out exactly in his explanation of this, is that he identified society, what's outside of the individual, as government, rather than recognizing that what really shapes the individual is what we call civil society, the independent, autonomous elements of society outside of government that have the most influence in shaping you. That is the family, that's the church, that's the community, that's the PTA, that's all the things that Tocqueville talked about as the glory of America, the little platoons that others have talked about. And that is the essence and the glory and the protection of American liberty. Because these institutions, civil society, are what stand between the citizen and the state. A totalitarian society is one where they deliberately try to destroy all the intermediate institutions so that the individual is naked before the state and can be utterly controlled and manipulated. The stories of, in Stalinist Russia, how the child would tell on the parents, turn him in because he loved Stalin, and he became a child of the state. Well, liberalism doesn't attempt to do that deliberately. Its intentions, I believe, are honorable and good and very humane. But it does not understand that by increasing the scope and the reach and the power and the authority of the central state, it inevitably squeezes and compresses and marginalizes all those elements in civil society, particularly the family and then the church. You look at the side effects that Obama's having on the relations of people with their churches. You look at the effect that welfare had on the family. One of the reasons I moved from left to right, and I write about this in the introduction, is that I had been a Great Society liberal. I believed in the intentions of the war on poverty. And then one day, in the beginning of the middle of the 1980s, the empirical evidence started to come in, real facts. And as a physician, as a scientist trained, I'm open to empirical evidence. If I give a patient a drug and it kills the patient, I stop giving the drug. And it turned out, from Charles Murray and James Q. Wilson and researchers with very hard science behind them, that the war on poverty not only did not help the people it was intending to help, but it undermined them and destroyed the communities. And that, ironically, of course, the abolition of welfare in 1996 led to the quickest drop in child poverty in modern history. So that was sort of the event that had its greatest effect on me in moving left to right. But the point I want to make in the book, and that I make in these essays, particularly the one about Obama and did the state make you great, is that they do not understand how their administrations have these effects on civil society and ultimately leave the individual naked before the state. Doesn't only harm the individual, but actually diminishes the liberty and the autonomy of the individual, because he has no other autonomous institutions on which to attach himself up and against the state. So I write about this, and I try to explain how I moved left to right. And I do that in an introduction. I've never done that before in my writing, because I don't think I'm a particularly interesting subject. I try actually in every column to avoid the use of the word I, but it's so lazy and easy that I use it a lot. But the ideal column is one in which you never use the word I, and the argument will carry you right through without interjecting yourself. But nonetheless, I do believe people have a right to change politically, but I also believe that if you're in public life and you do change, you have an obligation to explain how it happened and why. And that's what I try to do in the book. And so the long answer for the question where I said about Walter Mondale being young, the long answer is in the book. And I try to explain these influences that had me move from left to right. Of course, it wasn't an original path. It was well trodden by Ronald Reagan, among others. So that's sort of the heart of the book, the politics, and a little bit of the biographical introduction. But there's one more thing that the book is about, and it accounts for the title, and it accounts for the spirit of the book, if I can be so immodest as to talk about it. And that is, the book is in some ways a kind of ode, muted but spirited, to politics itself. This isn't a really good time in history to be championing politics, particularly over the last 6 weeks or so. I won't go into detail about that. But it hasn't been a pretty picture. But I write about this in the introduction. I try to explain why the book is constructed the way it is, because I've been fascinated by the essential paradox of our public life. It consists of this. What I believe is that the things that really matter are the things that are elegant and beautiful, hard and demanding, things that are testimonies to the flourishing of the human spirit. And I write about this at the very beginning of the introduction, and I'll read just a little piece of it. What matters? What are the things that I really believe are important in in human development and in our lives. What matters? Lives of the good and the great. The innocence of dogs, the cunning of cats, the elegance of nature, the wonders of space, the perfectly thrown outfield assist, the difference between historical guilt and historical responsibility, homage and sacrilege and monumental architecture, fashions and the follies, and the finer uses of the F word, which was the column I wanted to start the book with. But for some odd reason, my publisher thought it would be a bad idea. And I love this column. If I remember, it begins like this: I'm sure there's a special place in heaven for those who've never used the F word. I will never get near that place, nor will Dick Cheney. As I say, actually, he liked it too. What matters? Manners and habits, curiosities and conundrums, social and ethical. Is a doctor ever permitted to kill a patient willing to die? Why, in the age of feminism, do we still use the phrase women and children? I have a column on that, and I seem to be the only person in the country disturbed by its continued use, and I'm not even a feminist. How many lies can one tell? Is one allowed to tell to advance stem cell research? Something also I write about in the book, and in which I talk about what President Bush did in elevating the national debate on bioethics in a way that has never been done in American history, and for which history will be very grateful, as will our progeny. What matters? Occam's razor, Fermat's last theorem, the Fermi paradox, in which the great man asked, why, with so many habitable planets out there, why in God's name have we never heard a word from a single one of those civilizations? These are the things that most engage me. They give me pause, pleasure, and wonder. They make me grateful for the gift of consciousness. And for 3 decades, they have occupied my mind and commanded my pen. This book was originally going to be a collection of just those essays and columns. It was going to be about everything but politics. Things beautiful, mysterious, profound, or just odd. The working title was There's More to Life Than Politics. But in the end, I couldn't, and this is where I get to the theme of the book. I couldn't for a simple reason. For the same reason I left psychiatry for journalism. Because while science, medicine, art, poetry, architecture, chess, space, sport, number theory, and all things hard and beautiful promise purity, elegance, and sometimes even transcendence, they are fundamentally subordinate. In the end, they must all bow to the sovereignty of politics. Politics, the crooked timber of our communal lives, dominates everything because in the end, everything lives or dies by politics. You can have the most advanced or efflorescent of civilizations. Get the politics wrong and everything stands to be swept away. This isn't ancient history. This is Germany 1933. This is China during 5 years of the Cultural Revolution, when they set out, because they got their politics so wrong, to destroy 5,000 years of one of the most glorious civilizations on earth. And it isn't even ancient history. This is North Korea today, a place in the grip of a mad politics, a mad Stalinism that has produced an enslaved people, and the utter desolation, spiritual and material, of an entire land. In the end, everything depends on getting the politics right. And here's the paradox. Politics in daily practice is grubby and grasping and cynical and manipulative, and in some ways quite appalling, as we have seen recently. Or think of Disraeli describing his rise to the prime ministership as climbing the greasy pole. Not exactly a romantic idea. Politics has none of the elegance and the beauty of art and music, poetry and science. But think of how in places where they get the politics wrong, not just art and poetry, but even science is corrupted. Remember, in the late 1940s, Stalin decided that genetics really means the transmission of inherited characteristics. which had been proven 100 years earlier to be untrue. But Stalin insisted on a new Soviet genetics. He found the scientist who would do it, Lysenko, and produced it, Lysenkoism, which is the ultimate expression of the power of a corrupted politics to corrupt and destroy and undermine and ruin everything that is hard and beautiful and elegant. That's why politics, of which so many want to wash their hands of today, and understandably so, in the end is sovereign and must be sovereign. It's why I left medicine, a life of unquestionable humanity and nobility, to enter a life of politics, because in the end, everything depends on getting the politics right. And that's why the book could not just be about the things that I cherish and love, the things that I think in the end kind of matter most, because in the end they don't. In the end, politics is sovereign. I end the book with one of the columns at the end of the book is about hyper-proliferation, about the age we are about to enter into, and I will not see, but the age that my son will live in. And it begins with a story about Richard Feynman, the great physicist. Feynman, as you know, was a man who, in the Challenger disaster, he was able to crack it brilliantly in a way that explained everything. He was actually one of the youngest scientists at Los Alamos. He actually would amuse himself in his spare hours by breaking into the safes of the other scientists and leaving little notes behind. Gotta love the guy. He actually spent a year later on when he was at Cornell. He took a year off to learn the bongos in Brazil. The reason I tell you this isn't just to amuse you, but to give you the idea that this was a very energetic and driven guy, not given to melancholy. And yet there is a point in his biography where he writes when he came back from Los Alamos, after he had witnessed Trinity and the new era of the atomic age. He writes he was on his way to Cornell and he saw people working on a bridge. And he thought to himself, why are they doing this? Don't they understand? This is all useless. And again, he was not a guy who dwelt on that, and he went on to do these wonderful things in his life. But that brought home to me the fact that everything is going to hinge in the future on how we deal with that problem among all the great problems of our time. Our species has been around for 200,000 years. We acquire knowledge of the bomb, and within 17 years, the Cuban Missile Crisis, we come within a hairbreadth of self-destruction. This does not bode well, but this tells you how utterly important it is, particularly as we enter an age of hyper-proliferation, where it's not going to be a one-on-one game of deterrence, where it's going to be three-dimensional chess. We are going to have to develop the politics, internal and external, the policies and the diplomacy, and the military, and all the contingencies that are going to have to understand and deal with this. This is the overriding question. Now, I bring this up as a way simply to make the point of why these two elements are in the book. The beautiful stuff that I like to write about, and that's the first half of the book. But then the politics in the end, they're going to have to preserve and protect the beautiful side. And lest I leave you all melancholic and depressed, let me end by saying two things. I have two ways of curing you of this. Number one is I'm still licensed. And I'm quite prepared to write for anybody who needs it a prescription for antidepressants. For those of you less pharmacologically inclined, I will leave you with a notion that I've always had about the providential nature of American politics, how it seems as if we always end up finding the right way. We're a little colony on the outskirts of Western civilization, and we produced in the 18th century the greatest generation of political geniuses ever assembled on earth to produce a constitution that has given us a republic that has endured longer than any in the history of mankind. In the 19th century, we are a country that needs a Lincoln, and a Lincoln arises. In the 20th, during the Depression, and to lead us in the Second World War, we find our FDR, and in the second half we find our Reagan. This is not to say that we will always be able to find our way, but there is something about the American spirit, about the bedrock decency and common sense of the American that seems to help us find our way, and we do. And if that isn't enough to cheer you up, I will leave you with a remark, a comment of my favorite pundit, Otto von Bismarck, not generally known for punditry, generally known for invading other countries successfully, who once actually said, God looks after children, fools, drunkards, and the United States of America. He said that in 1890, and I hope to God he still does. Thank you very much.
So are there any questions? I think we have, do we have microphones? Am I told? Microphones are around. Okay, just raise your hand. Yes, sir.
Dr. Krauthammer, who is your very best friend?
My very best friend? Before I give you the answer, I'll remind you what Harry Truman once said. If you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. The Krauthammers have improved on that. We have 2 dogs in case one turns on us. So the correct answer is Maggie and Willie, but I'm not sure which one it really is.
So we actually have a microphone over there, right, Cindy?
Yes.
And there's one over here. I don't know why I can't see these. So if you have a question, go to the microphone. How's that?
A very
So I have a
sharp.
question. So Charles, explain Occam's razor.
It's the principle in science by which, when faced with a choice of explanations for any natural phenomenon, you always choose the simplest on the assumption that nature is cunning and nature is very concise and parsimonious. So if you have a very elaborate explanation for evolution, or you have a very clean one like Darwin, you would accept the more precise and concise one on the assumption it isn't always true, but it is a rule of thumb that always prevails, almost always prevails. I mean, Einstein, for example, was able to reduce everything into one equation. I mean, everything, but I mean the major achievement of his, the jump in physics in the early 1900s was E equals mc squared. Now, if you have seen the solution to Fermat's last theorem, it's about 200 pages of hieroglyphics that only 10 people on Earth can understand, and they tell us it's the right solution. Einstein did it in half a line. Now that is the perfect example of what I refer to when I talk about the elegance of nature, and that's what Einstein worshipped. He assumed that God is parsimonious, concise, and he once said in his opposition to quantum mechanics, that which involves a lot of chance in its calculations, God does not play dice with the universe. So that's Occam's razor.
Thank you.
Sorry that I just dropped it in there without explanation. But
No, it was important.
I figured it would make you purchase the book. And the Crown people are sitting right there from Crown Books, and they're checking on me how many references I make per hour.
Yes.
Dr. Krauthammer, you mentioned earlier in your remarks about how the Obama administration has continued many, and in fact even kind of doubled down on many of the national security policies of the Bush administration in prosecuting the war on terror, and how President Obama certainly has not shied away from an aggressive prosecution of the war on terror. And you also mentioned later the at least former existence of a national security wing of the Democratic Party. Given that, would you see President Obama in some sense as a kind of reincarnation of the national security Democrat? Or if not, what's the distinction?
The answer to that is God, no. And the reason is that he is totally reluctant to engage in all this. I think he's deeply philosophically opposed, and he keeps telling us that. I mean, he does the drone warfare, he does the rendition, he does all the things that President Bush instituted. And the reason he does it is that he knows that he has to do it as commander-in-chief. But then he goes ahead and he gives a speech, what was it, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, this war on terror has to end. This has gone on long, and then he goes on and he elaborates how it's undermining our lives and our democracy and our privacy. I mean, that's pretty ironic, isn't it? I mean, he's running the largest snooping operation in the history of the species, and he's deploring how the war on terror is undermining our privacy. As the commander-in-chief, he has to do this. But every time he opens his mouth, you hear him telling us, I don't really want to do it. In fact, I want the war to end. I'm going to declare the war. I'm going to unilaterally end the war. He talks about unilaterally ending wars. He thought he did that in Iraq. He didn't. He pulled out at a point where we had won the war and undermined all our successes. He wants to unilaterally end the war on terror. Well, there's a problem with that. There's another guy on the other side. And until he decides the war is over, the war is not over. So he gives speeches in which I would say, you morally disarm your own people by telling them basically the illegitimacy of the war and how much it's harming the core of Americanism. So how do you expect to get popular support? And then at that point he says, oh, we're going to have to pull out of Afghanistan because there is no popular support. Well, if you don't give a speech in 6 years to explain why you're doing it, you're not going to get any popular support. The point I want to make is that his rhetoric undermines the war that as commander-in-chief he actually has to carry out, and it leads to a philosophical incoherence. He rails against Guantanamo. He hasn't even stopped railing against it after he's kept it open for half a decade. That's a bit odd, isn't it? You're keeping it open because you know you have to, and yet you're denouncing it every day. Even in that speech, he said what a terrible thing Guantanamo was. So I don't agree with that at all. I think of anything, he's the most anti-national security as a Democrat, as a thinker, as somebody who influences his side of the aisle, if you like. And the reason there's so much unrest in the country is because you need a president to explain why he's doing it and to explain the virtues of the policies he's carrying out, rather than undermining them, even as he carries them out in a way that he tries to cover up, for example. I was sort of shocked to discover all this NSA stuff after he gave a speech talking about how all this national security state stuff was undermining us. So, I mean, I think that's the problem with the kind of presidency he's carried out in national security. And he's going to leave a party behind him that will continue what I think was the philosophical element of his foreign policy.
Next.
Dr. Krauthammer, thank you for being here. You've talked a lot about the importance of politics, and I'm wondering if you know if there's any candidates you see currently or potential candidates that you think can win in 2016 and simultaneously enact a strong reform conservative agenda.
Yes, I think we're going to have a good shot in 2016. I think we're going to have a very strong field as opposed to 2012, which, if I could say as an aside, was a quite winnable election. And Romney, who I think was an honorable man who I liked, I supported. I voted for him, and I would have liked to see him. I think he would have been a good president. Unfortunately, he had a slight handicap, that he spoke conservatism as a second language. And that was evident in one of the debates when he was asked by Newt, what were you doing in the early 90s when our revolution was being carried out. And he said, you know, I was a businessman. It's an honorable profession, but, you know, I came to politics late, and it shows. Because in one of the debates when he was trying to show, you know, how reliable he would be ideologically, he said, you know, in Massachusetts, I had a severely conservative administration. Now, think about that word. Severe is a word you generally use in association with head wounds and tropical storms. I have never heard it associated with governance. But now, and he was the best of the field, but it was a weak field. We have excellent candidates. We have governors who I think are going to be helped by the fact that they're outside of Washington. And Washington is now in good favor. And I see, you know, Christie of New Jersey, a general of Louisiana, Susana Martinez in New Mexico, a Scott Walker of Wisconsin is very strong. And then in the Congress, you've got, you know, people who I think can carry their weight. You've got a Marco Rubio and others. So I think we're going to have a very strong, we're going to have fewer debates, which was a catastrophe having 21 debates and the words 999 repeated 90,000 times. It didn't help us very much. Fewer debates, strong candidates, and we are going to have the wreckage of the Obama administration as the backdrop, particularly Obamacare, which is unraveling as we speak. So I think it's not going to be the cakewalk people imagine that Hillary will have. And for the people who've asked me in the past about my own presidential intentions, I'm not, thank you, but I'm not fishing for compliments. I'm just headed for a really good line, which is I want to declare right here that if nominated, I will not run. But if elected, I'll serve. I'm just terminally lazy, and I don't want to go to the Iowa State Fair. No disrespect to Iowa, but where were we? I digressed again.
You know, actually, I thought you were born in Canada until I read your bio.
Oh, no.
So you could run for president.
That is a malicious lie spread by the vast left-wing constituency. Let me state right here, I am not now, or have I ever been, a member of the Canadian citizenry.
Okay. Question over here.
Doctor, there are international critics that say our drone program is terrorism in itself on a grand scale. Lots of innocent people are getting killed, and President Obama admits that he makes the final call on who lives and who dies. And I was just wondering what you thought about the paradox that we're claiming to fight terrorism, but we're actually creating more animosity in the communities that we're attacking.
With all due respect, this is the opposite of terrorism. Terrorism is the deliberate attack on innocent people to achieve a political end. What we are doing in the drone strikes is a deliberate attack on people who do that for a living and for a life and for a mission and for a religion. We deliberately attack them, trying to take all the care that we can not to hurt innocent civilians. It is the polar opposite. It is the mirror image. It is the exact antithesis of terrorism. And we need it, as we need a lot of other tools, if we are going to defend ourselves. We are facing, as President Bush explained from day one, a new kind of barbarism. And I'll give you one example of this. In the last few weeks, we've been hearing about the assassination in Pakistan by the Taliban of people who are distributing the vaccine to prevent polio to children. Now, there is no greater depravity than that kind of activity. The killing of people who are risking their lives to prevent the spread of polio. And yet, this is part of the ideology of the barbarians that we are facing. In the face of that, we fight as we can with all the tools available. And if we have a way to use a drone to attack a specific individuals, and we always try to minimize the damage, that under any criterion of just war theory would fit well, and it absolutely has to be continued.
Dr. Krauthammer, thank you again for being here as well. I was wondering if you could comment on the Arab Spring, 2 questions as well, and how long you think that will be and the impact that it will have, as well as, often I've heard Romneycare and Obamacare compared, and he's actually a close friend of the family, and from what I understand, Romneycare is not a federalized program. In fact, it was in Massachusetts, it was an option, and that what the people wanted, but it wasn't federalized or. Does that explain what
Sure.
I'm?
Well, let me take them one at a time. On the Arab Spring, I think what's happening is the Arab world has come to the end of an era. It started out that the decolonization lasted for about half a century, and when they emerged, they fell quickly from a dynastic. They were a series of countries run by monarchs. They were swept away beginning in the early 1950s by Nasser, who championed this kind of Arab socialism, Arab nationalism, pan-Arabism, which was a mixture of socialism and militarism with a heavy bureaucracy. It was said, I think, by Pat Moynihan that where they learned all these things, the third world leaders who came to power after they were decolonized, all of them became socialist. He said that the London School of Economics had done more damage to the third world than any imperial power in history, because all of this ended up in ruin. So that 50 years of the military dictatorships, with example Nasser and Saddam, the Baathists in Syria and elsewhere, that is being swept away, even though it's come back to some extent in Egypt. The problem is that I'm not sure whether the Arab political culture is going to get directly to democracy. It looks as if, particularly the example of Egypt, where they've swung to the Muslim Brotherhood and then back to the military dictatorship, that there may have to be a phase that could last a decade or two or longer before, and I think in the end they will be as amenable to democratic outcomes as you've seen in Eastern Europe, as you've seen in the Pacific Rim countries, as you've seen in Latin America, and that is developing in Africa. I don't believe that there's an Arab exceptionalism where they're immune to this. But it's not going to have overnight. It will take a long time, because as, for example, in Iraq, these dictators managed to destroy so much of civil society, those institutions that preserve the autonomy and the liberty of the individual, that there's going to be a lot of rebuilding to do. And as I was saying to the president a little earlier when we spoke, it's a pity that we had to leave Iraq at a time when the war had been won, and where the civil war had been suppressed, and where al-Qaeda had been defeated, because it really did have a chance in the near term to get to that, perhaps not a Jeffersonian democracy by any means, but some approximation of it that could have been an example to the rest of the Arab world. So on that score, I think it's going to be a long time, and it's going to be a dangerous one. And we can't afford the kind of random zigzag foreign policy that has been carried out by this administration in the Middle East. On Romneycare, all I would say is there are differences with Obamacare, but it wasn't exactly very wise of the Republican Party to choose as a standard bearer in an election where the size and scope and reach of government, the liberal overreach that had occurred in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, and that had sparked that crushing defeat for the Democrats in 2010. A friend of mine said that wasn't an election, that was a restraining order. After the lesson of that, which was if we make the case against this liberal overreach, and we make the case, as I try to do in the book, for a limited government, we're going to win every time. And the centerpiece of that, of course, was Obamacare. But it's hard when you choose as your nominee somebody who had instituted something rather similar and parallel in Massachusetts. And I say it in tribute to Romney. He didn't run away from that. He was proud of that achievement. And he didn't renounce it as a way to get ahead politically. But it made it very hard in that particular election, which was a very winnable election, to make the case with Obamacare as a centerpiece of it, as it had been in the 2010 midterm. And I think that will not be a problem for our nominee in 2016, because they will have the wreckage of Obamacare to campaign on. And you can already see Democrats in the Senate who are up for re-election running away, and it's going to become a sprint within a few weeks.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Let's hope that we have another president like President Bush. Otherwise, I'm going to lose a lot of faith.
Well, I'm for changing the 26. Well, let's not. The man is enjoying his life. Let's not wreck it.
Sorry? Yeah, last question.
Thank you for your time tonight. My question is regarding an article that Daniel Henninger wrote for the Journal maybe a month ago. And he basically said that the strategy that Republicans should employ is to not attack Obamacare, and it would eventually fall under its own weight. This seems more realistic today than it did then, and I was curious what you thought about that. And personally, I'm skeptical because I've never seen an entitlement be taken away. But he made that argument, and so I don't know if you're familiar with him, but I thought that you might have an opinion.
Well, actually, I concur with him. An entitlement to be resistant to being taken away has to actually be instituted. And it has to have some success in being implanted. And this may not, this could be a very rocky infancy that Obamacare may not survive. I think it's not definitive, but it's more likely than not that it will collapse of its own weight. And that's been what I was advocating during the shutdown. I thought that tactically it was a mistake. There was no reason to call for the overthrow of Obamacare by legislation when there was not a chance in hell that you could do that. Under our system, you really can't undo a law from one house of Congress. There was no way it was going to be undone. And that we were heading into October the 1st when the shutdown began was also the day when Obamacare, this grand new website that was going to revolutionize our health care, signed up exactly 6 people. I mean, that isn't even enough to field a baseball team. There'd be no outfield. So I don't think that bodes well. I think, it's an old adage. I think I mentioned it earlier. When the other guy is committing suicide, get out of the room, Perhaps, hand him a pistol, maybe to make it a little easier. And cleaner for the CSI crew coming in later. But there was no reason to get in the way, and I think what Republicans ought to do right now, if they sincerely believe, as I do, that Obamacare is going to hurt the country, it is not the way to go about attacking one or two very specific and important problems about American medicine, the uninsured, which I think one could have attacked very narrowly in a way that wouldn't redo the entire 1/6 of the U.S. economy. That actually is, I think, the essence of liberal overreach. It's what Rahm Emanuel said, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, when he basically said, we're going to use this opportunity when we have control of the Congress to institute a liberal dream of 100 years, nationalizing health care. There was no reason to redo and reshape and remake 1/6 of the economy as a way to attack the problem of the uninsured. So I think this will, in the end, it is very likely to collapse in and of its own weight. And then the GOP has to be ready, and conservatives have to be ready, to address the moral issue, and it's a serious one, of the uninsured. We want to make sure all Americans have access, but there are ways to do it. There are conservative ways to do it, honest ways to do it, in which you aren't hiding the cost and pretending and lying about what the effects are you going to do of your policy are going to be. And I think that would be the essence of a conservative approach. So, I mean, I would say that in the end, that is going to be the outcome, very likely to be the outcome. And we ought to be prepared to watch it dissolve and then have an alternative. And that, I think, will be the road to victory if we can do this in 2016.
Charles, I know you have to catch a plane, but I can't let you leave without asking you a question about a pastime that you love, which is chess. So does chess fit into the kind of the beautiful and the soft, or does it fit into the political?
Oh, it's the beautiful and the soft and the elegant, and I know a lot of people consider it eccentric that I once drove from Washington to New York to watch a chess game. Actually, I did that twice. And people they shake their heads when they hear that. And I do have a column in the book called The Pariah Chess Club, where I describe a group of us who played on Monday nights in my house. Speed chess, which is an entirely different game. You're racing against the clock. It's the stuff that you see the vagrants in the park playing, and it's great fun. We were called the Pariah Chess Club because at the time, one of the founders was Charles Murray, who wasn't able to safely appear on campuses. Dinesh D'Souza, who had a similar problem. And the fourth of the founders was a perfectly respectable music critic for the Washington Post, but he was grandfathered as a pariah because he associated with the three of us. So that was and chess is a very elegant game, and there's a lot of music in it, which is, I try to describe in prose, and it was sort of a lot of fun. But I have to admit that I gave it up a couple of years ago, and I gave it up cold turkey. I was asked why, and I was said because it's an addiction, it's a poison. You find yourself playing speed chess on the internet at 2 in the morning, and you realize that you're the equivalent of an alcoholic alone in a motel room drinking Aquavelva. So I'm on the wagon, or am I off the wagon? I've never been able to figure out which is which, but I'm in remission and enjoying it.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles Krauthammer, for giving us a memorable evening, and I think we should leave on that wonderful phrase that you used in your talk, things elegant and beautiful, hard and demanding, which I think is what life is all about. This has been a memorable evening, I think, for all of us, and thank you, President Bush, for being here, and happy birthday, Mrs. Bush, and thank you again, Charles Krauthammer.
Sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.